And the added complexity of COP this year is that the mechanism was never designed to deal with the sudden boom and the sudden growth of AI infrastructure and the emissions that are a part of that, the emissions of the data centers, but also the emissions of the infrastructure itself, the extraction, and also the amount of energy that is going to be needed from there and just how it doesn't exist at the moment. So it's going to have to come from existing fossil fuel sources. And it doesn't deal with that at the moment. And if you look at what's forecasted in terms of emissions, it will completely blow budgets out to the point where 1.5 isn't going to be achievable. And so it's going to be such an important year to be talking about all of these. And this year we're talking about the implementation of each country's NDCs and climate goals and what it's going to take and the commitments to that. And it's going to be really interesting to see how Australia, I guess, shows up to that or what the plans are going to look like now that it's a country committed to our infrastructure. And yes, we've got to figure out what's going to happen for those extra emissions. We're here to fight, and it was turning victims into warrior stories. And it's a narrative that has shifted so much of the conversation for such a long time. And actually, the next iteration of the warrior narrative is actually turning our warriors, because that's what we've had. People who've been fighting for a long time into world builders and teaching our youth how to do things like build basic solar panel systems or understanding what they look like or being able to build and maintain them or giving them the skills that they need to be able to apply for these grants and just thinking through their projects and being able to support them to do so many incredible things. And so shifting from warriors to world builders is where we're at. And the young people have also really grasped that, taking that really well too.
Acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're joining this conversation. We pay our respects to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today.
Okay, hello, welcome to the Water Talks. My name is Fred Ragg, and I'm very lucky to be joined today by Joseph Sikulu. Joseph is a Tongan man from Ha'api and Vaini in Tongatapu in Tonga, but also growing up in Darug country in Western Sydney. Joseph is an environmentalist, cultural and queer activist. He spent more than a decade building a movement of the Pacific climate warriors across Pacific communities, both on island and throughout the diaspora. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. So part of what we do on the Water Talks, or what we're trying to do, is we're trying to have the conversations that are not being had very frequently out in the world. And we are a group of people who sort of came together and have seen all these things going on in the world, and that conversations aren't happening across divides and aren't happening in the places where they really need to be happening. So I'm excited to spend today talking to you, about the COP31, which is coming up, and what that's going to mean for the Pacific and for Australia, and what this new setup of the COP means, but also just going wherever the conversation takes us. Is there anything you'd like to say about yourself before we kick off? Is there anything that people should know about you?
No, other than I think I find myself at a time in my life where I have been pushing myself to look beyond the work that I have been doing to further understand what things look like in their entirety, especially when you're looking at a system like COP and the climate crisis. And this year we're approaching like 31 years of negotiations and still haven't kind of like dealt with the climate crisis in the way that we should. And so I am looking at things a lot differently than I normally have. I do see the value, and I understand why we need to be a part of these conversations. But if I do sound at any point any kind of cynical, that's why. It's because I'm questioning a whole lot of things at the moment. But yes.
What is maybe the biggest thing that you're questioning at the moment when we talk COP and climate negotiations?
Oh, mostly the question I've been asking myself is whether or not the UNFCCC actually is able to deliver on what it's supposed to and deal with the climate crisis in the way that we need to. And I say that mostly because throughout the 3 decades of these negotiations, we've still failed to address the root cause of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. And they still, and fossil fuel producing nations and fossil fuel producers have so much leverage and power within negotiations, and that we're forced to accept incrementalism as opposed to the ambition that is needed. And that's frustrating for a lot of people. And it's frustrating, especially for um, islands and countries who are on the front lines of the climate crisis and who have no choice but to be in these negotiations fighting for their lives practically. And yeah, it's frustrating, but yes, that. I don't even know if that made any sense.
It makes loads of sense, and it's actually a really nice, I think, segue into this COP 31, and the initial joint bid from Australia and the Pacific, and now that we're in this position where we're having to split responsibilities and that the actual COP is going to be held in Turkey, um, I'm wondering if maybe you can talk us through a little bit of the background of what's happened there, and we'll go into whether you think that this is a good outcome for the Pacific or if it's a bit of a cop out, maybe.
What happened there? My goodness. It's what kind of version do you want?
The brutal, honest version.
The brutal honest version is that Australia's bid for COP was just filled with a lot of uh, internal politics within the government. There was a lot of geopolitical influences that really shaped things. There was also a bit of what's the word? Um, they left a lot to the last minute.
Mm.
They left a lot to the last minute. They left the Pacific out for a very long time. I mean, Pacific leaders weren't a part of the negotiations of the COP uh, at any point. Um, the Department of Climate and Energy kind of took lead of this thing, but what was needed was a whole government approach. So everybody working together within the government to push for this bid, but it was just down to one department. And there was uh, people within this, like the Labour Party, who didn't want COP anyway. So there was a lot of conflict, and it led to Chris Bowen being put out on his own, and so he had to. And uh, Pacific leaders actually saw it as an opportunity to test Australia's capacity to advocate on behalf of the Pacific as a middle power in the world to see what's possible. And they kind of gave over their blessing and also their trust and just wanted to see what was going to happen. And it didn't work out the way we had hoped it would. And things at the end were a bit choppy. The reality is, Turkey out negotiated Australia in many ways, and they outplayed them in a whole bunch of stuff, and they ended up with COP. And yeah, we ended up with Australia being COP of president of the negotiations, and the Pacific is now just hosting pre-COP. And so, yes, it's all a bit messy.
That kind of seems to sit within this paradigm of the climate movement and climate change in a broader spectrum anyway, of like, we have these really heavily polluting countries, these heavily developed countries sitting like quite literally geographically separated from this massive region of the Pacific. And the story that's playing out at COP is almost like the story that's playing out in the climate crisis itself, that now we're going to have these negotiations taking place in Turkey, thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers from the Pacific, where the impacts are already being felt. What's that do for that sense of trust that the Pacific leaders were putting in Australia and were putting in the UN?
the thing about the UN is that uh, in the UN, it doesn't matter which UN mechanism it is. Uh, in the UNFCCC, what we see is that uh, might beats moral, and so
Mm.
the political might of a country, if they have the finances and the power to do it, they will outrank any of the countries who are standing out there on a moral platform, trying to urge the world to do what's right. And so what ends up happening is we don't end up doing what's right. We end up doing what the powerful countries want, and that ends up dragging on the negotiations. It's difficult and it's hard. And if you see our negotiators year after year, uh, they're literally giving everything they can, everything they have, trying every single ploy, every single tactic. We have got some of the most brilliant negotiators on the face of this planet because of they've been able to not just think outside of the box, but bring just lead with ambition in so many places. But they give everything, and sometimes it feels like it's a losing fight. But the reality is, we've got no choice but to continue to show up and to do these things and to lead and to show ambition and to try and give everything we have and hope that the world follows the leadership. But yes, it's just that constant disappointment.
And yeah, it feels like I don't know, but to me, it often feels like cop season is always disappointment season. Like there's a bit of a ramp up as we get to it. We start to surface all these questions that are going to be asked in the negotiations, and I can't remember in recent time being particularly delighted at the outcomes. It's always like, oh, we got a little bit of this. We've had the agreement that developed countries have got to compensate the developing countries, but we failed to lock in the plan to phase out fossil fuels. We failed
Yes.
to like. There's always, and I mean, I guess like negotiations and negotiations, and there's always ways you win and there's always ways you lose. But it feels like we're really the climate negotiations and beyond negotiations. We're talking about existential threats to life on this planet, and that
Yeah.
this should carry a bit more maturity than it does. Um, do you think that there's much value in the having the actual cultural and pre-COP things happening in the Pacific beforehand? Is there actually something that
Yes.
we gain from having that?
Yes. Um, Culture is a part of COP that is isn't normally there, but it's also a big part of who we are and how we act. And it's the reason why we do so much. And for people to understand who we are, but not just us, but also indigenous people all over the world, the cultural pieces are important. And it's also culture as in like culture, the mechanism that preserves all of our knowledge and everything that we inherit from our people and our understanding of that. It might not be like empirical data or scientific knowledge or anything, but these are things that we have held on to for thousands of years that are passed on to us and that uh, we know that are true to us. And the science is only just catching up to a whole bunch of this stuff. It's important for us to center culture in everything that we do. It's important for us to bring culture into the UNFCCC mechanism. It could be a way for us to try and shift things, to try and change the way people uh, hold space or show up into space. Or, but more than anything, it's important for the world to understand who we are. And this is the first time anything of this scale is coming into the region, and so it's important for us to like put everything we are out there for everybody to see and understand what it is that we're about.
Yeah, amazing. It something you mentioned reminds me. We were talking before we started recording about comparing notes that I also grew up in the Pacific in Fiji, and my dad called me one day with this story. Cyclones are a massive part of life out in the Pacific, and it's one of the things that we're looking at is getting more and more severe and more problematic with the changing climate. And my dad was out one day on the boat with one of the guys that works on this little farm that he has, and the guy said to him, "Oh, look, Greg, like see up there, there's a hawk's nest in the tree. And Dad said, yeah. And he said, see how it's built all the way up the top of the tree, up in the top of the branches. And Dad said, yeah. And he said, there's not going to be a cyclone this season because the hawk knows. And he says when it builds its nest down in the bottom of the tree, in the where the branches meet, that's the time you got to worry. And that's that, that cultural piece that you're saying, that there's this knowledge base that stretches thousands and thousands of years that doesn't make it into an assessment report all the time, or it isn't being brought into conversations. And I'm wondering if you think there's more that could be shared, or there's ways that we could be sharing, or even if there's stories that you think belong on these stages that we're not hearing about yet.
Yeah, so there is the LC platform, which is the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, and within their uh, traditional knowledge holders are key, and so that's uh, their gateway into the negotiations is through the LCIP, and so they do capture all of the traditional knowledge holders. They try and give them space, but it's a space on the margins. It's not centered within the negotiations, and so it does need to be brought in and centered more. Indigenous people do need to be given more of a voice and more power within the negotiations, and also from the perspective of understanding what it is to be in communion with the land, or to live in harmony, or to just appreciate what we have, so that everything isn't about money, but about our stewardship of where we live and uh, the environment around us. And so it's really important to bring those in there. It's it's one of the things that is going to be tried to be achieved within the pre-COP, and so uh, it's a week meeting in, I'm going to say October, but it probably isn't. I think it is. Uh, in October, and so the first few days are actually going to be in Tuvalu, and so it's a leaders meeting in Tuvalu, and Tuvalu is going to use it as an opportunity to show what uh, their cultural framework of their chiefs is like. And so the reason for that is that we're not just accountable to the UNFCCC, we have our own traditional mechanisms that we're also accountable to, and it's important for the leaders to see that. And so that's one of the things that Tuvalu wants to put on, like just expose people to, is what those traditional frameworks look like, so they can understand what that accountability looks like for us. And so 2 days will be held in Tuvalu, and then the rest of the time, uh, for the rest of the agenda, we'll be back in Nandi. And there is culture and faith woven into all bits of that. CSOs, all the movement have opportunity to run different kinds of side events throughout that week, and so it's an opportunity to be able to bring as much of our voice and story into this piece as we can, and to shape what comes out of pre-COP, which we hope will be something ambitious. I hope.
And so, what is, from a technical perspective, what are some of the things that might come out of pre-COP that would carry over into the negotiations, or yeah?
So pre-COP actually isn't a technical meeting, unlike the bond intercessionals. So it's a voluntary thing. It's supposed to bridge the bond intersectional. So when you think about pre-COP, think about it as like a preparatory meeting where we bring together as much of the world as possible and try to get everybody aligned before we go into the big COP. So everybody already knows what they're doing. So it's about bringing the frameworks together and making sure people, the tracks, everybody's set on where they're going. Like we're clear on what we want to negotiate out of that. Unfortunately, the outcomes from Bond this year were really disappointing, and so that's the starting point. And then trying to figure it out. The other thing that makes this really difficult is that the split between the presidencies, and so the agenda isn't actually set by the Pacific itself. Uh, Pacific has drawn up a concept note and what they believe agenda should be, and then it goes to Australia for some feedback, and Australia's got a lot of say in terms of what happens, and then after Australia Pacific agree on it, then it needs to be signed off by Turkey, and so Turkey at the end of it will have a say over what happens. And so it has to go through a long process, and that's actually happening just this week. And so we don't know exactly what's going to come out of it until the end of this week. But yes, it's a very frustrating process that our ministers are going through at the moment.
And do you think that that split presidency and this is kind of going back to the whole COP being split this way, but do you think that that will possibly hurt the ambitions that the Pacific have for the negotiations? Do you think it will help? Do you think it matters?
I think it helps. It helps in terms of we have more say over pre-COP than we ever would. And so there's an opportunity not just to set the agenda, but also to try and push the ambition as high as we can.
Mm.
Outside of like the agenda negotiation, it'll still happen because everybody's committed to that. It's also an opportunity for us to be centered. Australia has got, as president of negotiations, also has the opportunity to set like the co-facilitators of each space and has some power in there. So hopefully they will use some of that to bring more Pacific voices into those spaces, into those leadership roles. It's an important year this year because the second global stock take, which is the basically how we measure everything within the next 5 years, will be within the global stock take, and so the
Mm.
architecture of that will be set this year. And so have making sure that there's specific oversight to ensure like there's some kind of ambition in there is going to be important too. And so there is some worthiness. And even if you were to give us like something tiny like a grain of sand, we'd still turn it into something
Mm.
amazing, brilliant. So yes, I got no doubt about it. It's just at the moment really stressful to try and plan out with the Australian government at the moment.
Mm. Um, and do you think having people go and be present in the Pacific those 2 days in Tuvalu? I'm reminded of the Tuvalu. I think it was the Prime Minister who gave a speech to the UN, and he had the podium sitting in the surf on the
Oh yeah,
beach. And it was such this visceral moment of like, and Tuvalu being like one of, if not the most exposed countries in the world to rising sea level change. Do you think it's going to make a difference for people to go there and to stand there and to see?
this is also difficult to answer because the segment in Tuvalu is the leaders meeting, so it's actually closed.
Mm.
And here is where it becomes uh, what's the word? Oh, I can't even think of the word. Where it's like really sticky is that Australia will determine who is going to be invited into that. And what makes it hard between trying to organize pre COP is that DFAT and the Department of Climate Change like don't work together. They're doing separate things, and so it's not really cohesive. And so
Mm.
DFAT are going to be working on the leader segment in Tuvalu, and DQ and Minister Bowen's office on the agenda pieces in Nandi, and trying to figure out how that comes together is yes something we'll hope will be figured out this week. And so we don't actually know, but I will say this about Tuvalu. And also one of the things that is keeping me going within like these multilateral spaces is that Tuvalu is going to be hosting the second transitioning away from fossil fuels conference next year. And so the first one was held this year in Colombia, Santa Marta, and it was hosted by the Netherlands and Colombia. And the purpose of that was bringing together like minded countries who actually want to transition away from fossil fuels and do something tangible
Mm.
and make sure that there's actually some real impact. And there was a lot of movement there. And this is the kind of way that is going to either force the UNFCCC to change because we can see that people are outside doing things, or just let countries know that if it doesn't work within the UNFCCC, we're just going to have to make it work outside of it. And so
Mm.
Tuvalu is going to be hosting the next conference next year, and that's going to be pretty huge because hopefully, if we don't see any great outcomes come out of COP, then we've also got TAF2 in Tuvalu next year to look forward to.
Yeah, amazing. I want to hear more about the hopeful stuff, but before we get to it, I want to just dive a little bit deeper into the less hopeful things and talk about um, what's actually at stake for the Pacific when it comes to the climate crisis. And like for me, I've heard a lot. There was an initial plan in Fiji to relocate, I think, like 42 villages away from coastlines because rising sea levels are. This isn't like a 20-year, 30-year plan. This is like it's already happening. But I'd love to hear if you could talk a little bit more to what's actually at stake for the Pacific and Pacific Island nations and peoples.
Yeah, so the red line for the Pacific is 1.5 degrees. 1.5 to survive is the tagline because if we raise the temperatures anything above 1.5 degrees, then that's pretty much the end of it for a lot of our low-lying atoll nations like Tuvalu, like the Marshall Islands, like Tokelau. A lot of them are really counting on that. So it's a red line, it's a lifeline. One of the most difficult things since Paris, where that was ingrained into the COP, into the Paris Agreement, is that every year it comes up and it's being challenged or it's being tried to renegotiate it because 1.5 isn't just the temperature rise, but the to stay within 1.5 means that countries are going to have to give up a lot and start cutting. And the NDCs, or like the national targets and nationally determined contributions, are actually going to have to be really ambitious and actually really achievable. And yes, some countries don't like that. They want to take their time and they want to drag out the life of the fossil fuel industry for as long as possible. Um, and so that's the biggest fight. This year, it is going to be a huge one. And the added complexity of COP this year is that the mechanism was never uh, designed to deal with uh, the sudden boom and the sudden growth of AI infrastructure and the emissions that are a part of that, the emissions of the data centers, but also the emissions of the infrastructure itself, the extraction, and also the amount of energy that is going to be needed from there and just how it doesn't exist at the moment. So it's going to have to come from existing fossil fuel sources. And it doesn't deal with that at the moment. And if you look at what's forecasted in terms of emissions, it will completely blow budgets out to the point
Mm.
where 1.5 isn't going to be achievable. And so it's going to be such an important year to be talking about all of these. And this year, we're talking about the implementation of each country's NDCs and climate goals and what it's going to take and the commitments to that. And it's going to be really interesting to see how Australia, uh, I guess, shows up to that or what the plans are going to look like now that it's a country committed to AI infrastructure. And yes, we've got to figure out
Mm.
what's going to happen for those extra emissions.
It's really interesting timing to have the announcement of the centralized plan managing AI and the Office of AI being incorporated into Anthony Albanese's office, into the Office of the Prime Minister, um, to have that in the build up. And it hasn't looked at all like Australia is, or the government is intent on slowing down that AI development. Is that going to make for some pretty awkward discussions at COP? Do you think?
Um, yes, or I think DFAT now playing a role within pre-COP is going to make an interesting dynamic to see how these conversations happen. But also, a lot of these conversations with our with Pacific nations have moved from like big, big regional initiatives to bilaterals between countries, and like the Nakamal agreement between Vanuatu and Australia, or the Vavule between Fiji and Australia, which I guess on the day that was announced, uh, China's nuclear warning, nuclear testing into the
Mm.
region was also a show. I guess it's really playing out within geopolitics at the moment. And so it's going to be hard for it not to to shape the conversations of COP. And Australia has a lot of interest within the Pacific at the moment, now within like the rare earth minerals in the ocean bed and deep sea mining. And that in itself is going to play a big piece. And yeah, there's a lot of geopolitics is such an interesting thing at the moment to watch lots of pieces, lots of things happening in lots of places, and then we have COP where people are still just trying to make sure that we're still alive in the next decade.
It would be nice. It would be nice to stay alive. Do you think that the geopolitics at the moment and that competing interest, China and Australia in the Pacific, do you think that gives the Pacific a leg up in the negotiations?
No,
No.
it's making things a lot more difficult. Pacific strategy has always been like we'll just play every side, and so we'll take whatever we can from everywhere, from the US, from China, from Taiwan, from Australia, and now those relationships are really starting to form, and Taiwan is like emerging to be a really pivotal uh, spot in the region when it comes to AI, and we're going to have to watch out to see what happens there. And so, yeah, those relationships are going to have to be managed, and so it's making it a bit more difficult because where the countries weren't heavy-handed before, now you can start to see them being a bit more heavy-handed, a bit more possessive of what they're asking or what they're trying to do, and so yes, it's making it harder.
Okay, just what we need. Cool. Well, I mean, very much not cool, but I'd love to hear more about things that are giving you hope at the moment. You know, you mentioned Tuvalu and hosting the conference next year. Are there other things that you see in the world that make you feel hopeful, that give you energy to keep fighting?
Yeah, there is. I think the thinking outside of the box, the multilateralism from the margins, we can actually change things if we're just small groups of people working on the margins to try to change the bigger system. We can actually do that, and the TAF is proof of that. Seeing the way people are organizing and around the data centers, I think is really hopeful. It's it's also something that I think I'm hoping the climate movement grasp onto real soon too, and I think the the whole system that is AI, from like the extraction of rare earth minerals to the point where it's predicting everything we will do, is like if we don't take if we don't use the opportunity now to try and like influence the architecture of that, then the next generations are going to be stuck in the same thing that we're stuck in here with the UNFCCC, where we're just pushing incrementalism and not getting anywhere. And so we really need to get out there on the forefront of this uh, and hammer the government before they uh, like build all these regulations and build the infrastructure for this and the architecture of what this whole office is supposed to look like. We really need to be involved in it. And I know a lot of people are. There's lots of thinking outside of the box, which is really great. A lot of creativity that is coming up. And then this week in Sydney is actually Climate Ministers Talanoa, hosted by Chris Bowen, and all of the climate ministers from around the region are coming in to finalise a lot of the details for pre-COP. And our ministers we don't give them the flowers they deserve. And like in these spaces, they're just like soldiers. They just soldier on, and even though everything's stacked up against them, they continue to do the work and they continue to show up. And when I'm feeling cynical, I just sit down there with them and they just continue to push forward. And that, I guess, it rubs off and that gives me hope. It also just makes me feel happy that our region has leaders like this to advocate for them.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of this line that we've got in our show notes from you and from the Pacific Climate Warriors: the "We are not drowning, we are fighting." Um, you know, could you talk to that a little bit and the background of that and what that means for people?
Yeah, we're not drowning, we are fighting uh, was a call to arms for our youth. And if you look back over a decade ago to just before the Pacific Climate Warriors had formed, and the stories that were being told of the Pacifics, like the islands are going to sink, they're drowning, there's no point there. People were feeling really disempowered by the climate crisis and the narrative that was being told of the Pacific, and especially our young people. Uh, all they were hearing was a lot of doom and gloom. And so, we're not drowning, we are fighting was an opportunity to bring them in and reshape what that means for them. To take the narrative of we are not of drowning and saying we are not drowning, we're here to fight. And it was turning victims into warrior stories. And it's a narrative that has shifted so much of the conversation for such a long time. And actually, the next iteration of uh, the warrior narrative is actually turning our warriors, because that's what we've had, people who've been fighting for a long time, into world builders, and teaching
Mm.
our youth how to do things like build basic solar panel systems, or understanding what they look like, or being able to build and maintain them, or giving them the skills that they need to be able to apply for uh, these grants, and just thinking through their projects and being able to support them to do so many incredible things. And so shifting from warriors to world builders is where we're at. And our young people have also really grasped that, taking that really well too.
Mm. The One of the things about the Pacific that I love um, is also knowing that, like, for the indigenous people of the Pacific to have been where they are and to have found these homes meant traveling incredible distances and going through incredibly difficult circumstances
Yeah,
thousands of years ago. Like, it's so impressive to hear about wayfinders, you know, the spread of the Polynesian people through Polynesia down to New Zealand, the way
yeah,
the Melanesian migrant, like, just to actually get as far, like, it's not like it's a small area. It's not like the
yeah,
Pacific is like the Mediterranean or, you know, the Red Sea. It's the biggest ocean on the planet. And that I feel has created a people of incredible resilience, but also incredible warmth and love. Like, I have never felt so loved as I have being at home in Fiji with Fijian people, you know, like, and the same with any people in the Pacific. And that just really reminds me that the Pacific is a resilient place, and it's full of people who have come a long way and through a lot, uh, and have a strength that is just has enabled them to do incredible things, and I think and I believe will enable them to do incredible things in the days to come as well.
yes. And that's the importance of bringing culture into spaces like the negotiations. Is that because culture isn't just a practice of preservation; it's also memory. There's so much memory within those practices, and they come from uh, such a long way back. And we are caught up in a life, or maybe it's just capitalism that forces us to think that like progress is a linear climb. But we know that we just have to look back to understand the incredible feats that our ancestors have achieved, and to know that hey, we can, that's within us and we can do that. And that's the way we need to be looking at these negotiations, is that things do look like they're stacked up against us, or things do look like they're unachievable, but we come from people who achieve things that nobody thought was possible. And so we have to continue to believe that we can do the things that are impossible, because we have no choice other than that. But our ancestors have proven that we can do that. And so that's another reason why bringing culture into this is so important. And it's also so important for our negotiators to be able to practice their culture, because negotiation spaces are otherworldly, completely far removed from where we come from and who we are. And you have to be somebody different from like the person that you are at home. And you've got to present in a language that is foreign to you. And it's really text heavy and it's really technical. And when English isn't your first language, or these things are difficult. And so the practice of culture is the opportunity to be able to center yourself and to remind yourself who you are amongst all of this craziness, and to be able then to go back into that and do that. So it's important on so many levels that we continue to try, that we bring it in and continue to practice our culture within the process.
Mm, amazing. Okay, so hypothetical. COP's finished. We're at the end of the whole process. There's exhausted negotiators everywhere. And you read the news and you spit out your coffee and jump around the room because of what you're seeing. What would have to happen at COP to make you that excited this year?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to have to give that one some thought. But it's not just COP this year that is the opportunity to bring leaders into the Pacific, or to bring the worldview into the Pacific. There's also the Pacific Island Forum, and there's a section uh, that is going to be dedicated to leaders. And like one of the big pushes at the moment within the Pacific Island Forum and within the Pacific is that we transition the Pacific to 100% renewable energy. And that, to me, at the end of this year, if that's the goal that we've achieved, is that there's financial commitment in order to be able to help the Pacific achieve 100% renewable energy, then I'll be jumping for joy for that, because the only way we can actually break our region free from the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry is just to make sure they don't have to use fossil fuels. And so 100% RE for the Pacific is something that I'm hoping we see by the end of this year. Well, the commitment to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And we've not touched at all on your work at the Sunrise Project. Do you want to talk to that a little bit? Tell us what's been going on for the Sunrise Project, what your role there looks like, and what things are
We've been
happening
talking
in
about
that space.
it.
Okay.
Everything we've been talking about, that's what I do.
Okay. And how important is the role of orgs like the Sunrise Project and 350 org in this future that we're fighting for?
They're really important. Um, it's like in the cycle of movement life, I think we're at the point where things do feel like they've plateaued. And I think right across the movement, we just have to decide whether or not this is the moment we evolve and try something new, and or we just continue to do the same thing, and eventually just the movement will fall off. Um, Orgs are a bit uh, disconnected from like community at the moment. There is a bit of a disconnect there, and it's because of the way this system is set up and the way that we have to unfortunately measure success within NGOs and civil society is through quantity. You've got to count how many people come to this thing, or count how many solar panels you can install in this thing, or everything has to be a number. And when you're just focusing on number, then the qualitative data sometimes falls behind. It's like you can't measure how, like you can't measure the way that you have shifted a community's perspective on something, or the way you've empowered, made people feel empowered to be able to take action on things. And those are the things we need to go back and focus on, like back into our movement building. But these orgs are going to be important, and especially as we go into this AI future, we are going to be needing more civil society, holding civil society together and trying to bring people together and organizing. And so, yeah, the question now is: do we rise to the occasion, or do we continue doing the same thing as always?
And something you mentioned earlier was that how impressed you've been with the organizing around data centers, and that you thought that there was a lot to learn from that. What are some of those things that you think or have impressed you that you think could be good learnings?
Well, it's just felt organic. People are just angry about something, and rightfully so, they should be angry at the data centers, and we just need to be there to back them, to help them organize even uh, more strongly. And the reality is, like, I look here in Western Sydney, and where the data centers are going up, uh, they're going up in all the areas where the warehouses used to exist, the distribution warehouses that used to
Mm.
employ everybody practically in Western Sydney. Now all those jobs are being replaced, and now the distribution warehouses are being replaced with data centers. People should be angry about that, and uh, I think it's an opportunity for us to be able to explain to people what's going on, and help them understand how everything is connected to how a data center is actually connected to, like, the wider system of AI, and how they can see themselves a part of that. And so, yeah, when I see people out there just organically, I think that's what it is that makes me happy. It's the organic organizing. It's just people getting out there because they care about something, and we just got to tap into that.
And it feels like it's starting to literally come home. And something like AI feels really different to climate, but also not so different, as you said, about resource use and energy demands.
Yeah,
And something somebody said to me a while ago is, it's very hard for folks in Australia. They don't go out into their backyard and in the morning and go, oh, look, there's been a bit of climate change here. It doesn't hit home to them
yeah,
proportionally. And that's really interesting, with the AI data centers displacing logistics jobs, is the same as climate hitting particular nations differently. It's not an equal effect to everybody at the same time. But the data centers is such a sign of it's here, it's in your backyard, it's happening, and yeah, it's all connected and it's all coming home together.
yeah, and it'll continue to drive the climate crisis. It will make it even worse than it is right now. And so, unless we uh, figure out a way to hold tech companies accountable before things get bad, uh, yeah, don't want to
Yeah.
imagine what's going to happen. Yeah.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much. This has been a really amazing conversation. I just wanted to ask, is there anything you'd like to shout out? What can people do if they're listening and they're feeling motivated to learn more about either Sunrise Project or yourself? Or yeah, is there anything you'd like to direct people to, or leave them with?
Yeah, like the COP process seems really technical, but I do encourage people just to try and understand, like, just to learn a bit about the process or the system of the UNFCCC and how things work. Um, it helps you put a lot into perspective, and it helps you understand how something happening here in Australia affects something happening in the Pacific. And at the end of the day, we just have to, like, figure out how to build bridges between ourselves. And, like, it the climate crisis doesn't care who you are, what you look like, what you believe in, where you go to school, where you live, or what you make. It's going to affect us all in the same way. And the rise in AI infrastructure is going to make that even worse. And when you take some time to understand the systems that we participate in or that we live in, whether it's our democracy or the way that we vote or the UNFCCC, you begin to see how they weaponize our identities to turn us against each other, when we should be building bridges with each other to uh, fight the real evil people in this world. And that's what we need to do. And yeah, I guess it just comes to taking some time just to look outside of our box and look outside of our own world to discover something new, and uh, hopefully find ways to build bridges with people that you may not see eye to eye with, but share so much more, share so much with. I don't
Amazing.
even know if that makes sense.
It makes all the sense. And like I said at the start, that's something that we want to be doing here at the Water Talks, is encouraging people to have those conversations and encouraging people to start talking across the divide and building those bridges. I love that. Well, Thank you, Joseph. Thank you to everybody who's been watching along. And don't forget to subscribe, leave some comments, tell us what you liked about what Joseph said, and leave some questions and be a part of the conversation.